All right. Welcome, friends and comrades. Hope everyone is having a wonderful evening. Daniel Tutt here with Emancipation's podcast. Just want to welcome you to our first lecture in a new series that we're going to be offering on Thursday nights. Probably we're going to host one lecture a month on different philosophical issues in Marxism. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Sam Badger, who you'll meet in a moment. But before we introduce Sam, I just want to say a couple of things about other activities that we have here on the horizon. The first will be happening at the end of the month, which will dovetail really nicely for those of you that have been listening to the first series with Derek Varn and I on materialism. This will be a symposium on John Bellamy Foster's new book, Breaking the Bonds of Fate, Epicurus and Marx, published with Monthly Review. And I'm very pleased to have organized this and brought really, frankly, some of the best sort of materialist philosophers working today. Thomas Nail is an incredibly interesting young philosopher. I think he's at the University of Denver. Helena Sheehan is one of the foremost Marxists working on the intersection of Marxism and science. And Katerina Kolozova, who I teach with at the School for Materialist Research. I recently hosted a panel on her new book on materialism. So we have sort of three, I think, very dynamic materialist Marxist philosophers. And then, of course, we'll have John himself to offer remarks and offer responses. So this will be probably like a 2-hour symposium during the day on Tuesday, May 26th. I just want to encourage everybody to check out Breaking the Bonds of Fate. John Bellamy Foster kind of considers this book in his wider, as like a trilogy, in his wider studies on ecological Marxism. So do check that out. And if you're so interested, we probably will have a few pre-events, study events on Tuesday nights running up to this event. So join the Patreon to learn more about that. Another announcement that I want to make is that I've recently published a new book with C. Derek Varn. Some of you may have seen this on social media, called The People Are Not One: Socialist Strategy After Left Populism. This is the first time I've ever announced it publicly, at least on the Emancipation's channel. It's a pamphlet. It's kind of like a manifesto. It's something we're both very excited to offer to everyone. Comes out at the end of June. We will be doing some live events for this. And so if comrades are interested in hosting us, reach out to me. But I mean, really, we just want to sort of have this book be widely read. We feel like we're sort of saying something about our present political moment that's not being said on the socialist left. And I think it's delivered in a very strong way. So, yeah, comrades can obviously, join the Patreon to learn more about all of these activities. And it always helps to support. You can join for free, but it always helps to support, at like $3 or $5. But I'm not going to advertise that too much because we have a lecture to hear from Sam Badger. But it's not going to be like a lecture in a formal sense. We're going to have Sam offer like 15 to 20 minutes of sort of reflections on his book, which is entitled Karl Marx's Ethics of Human Flourishing. So comrades may remember that I hosted a live event in DC with our friend and fellow philosopher, Vanessa Wills on Marx's ethical vision. And Badger, his text is very much in line with this kind of new approach to Marx, thinking through these kind of ethical questions. And I find this interesting for us, given that for the last year, we have really been immersed in studying Althusser. And obviously, the anti-humanist perspective of Althusser is something I want to talk with Sam about quite a lot tonight, where he sees his work as in line with an Althusserian vision, what some of the limitations to anti-humanism may be, and what some of the strengths of humanism may be. Because in multiple places in the text, Sam really sort of owns the label of humanism and makes a very strong case that we should understand Marx as having a kind of a set of normative commitments, and that ultimately those normative commitments are found in the Aristotelian tradition itself. So with that little opening, let me welcome Sam Badger to the show. Sam, how are you this evening?
Great, thanks.
So Sam finished his PhD pretty recently, I think, from the University of South Florida, where he's still teaching philosophy. And his first book is entitled Karl Marx's Ethics of Human Flourishing. Just recently finished it, and I must say it is a highly systematic work. So congratulations on this kind of rigor that you bring to bear on the topic at hand. And Sam, before you give a few remarks in a lecture about the book, I wanted to invite you to tell us a little bit about why the topic. Why the topic? What was it in your own study of Marx that drew you to this question of reading Marx in this particular way that you've chosen? Did you have a sort of was Aristotle, did he come before Marx? Tell us the prehistory, perhaps, of where this
Yeah.
book came from.
Well, some of it's personal, I guess, because I've always been a little troubled by the way we live in a capitalist society, and the way value, that people are valued, largely in terms of what their labor gets on the market, or what they already own can get on the market, and that kind of goes back to me being a kid, honestly. But I think of my first interest in Aristotle really came when I took an ethics class in community college back in like 2005. First real philosophy course I had ever taken. I was kind of toying being a philosophy major. And it's like Bentham was all right, Mill was all right, Kant. I mean, I really like Kant, but I couldn't quite buy his theory of ethics. And I read Aristotle, and I'm like, wow, this is great. I really like this. But then, of course, Aristotle's like a big time elitist. And, who is the virtuous person for Aristotle? It's, this aristocrat who has, a few slaves and a decent plot of land and has the time to, engage the philosophical ideas and cultivate these aspects of their personality. Um, and so I kind of already had these two interests. And I remember, reading Capital for the first time in between my undergrad and graduate studies, and being really interested by these passages where, Marx starts talking about Aristotle, like in the first chapter, even, this, the crematistic logic, which is, I hadn't read the Politics, so then I'm off reading Aristotle's Politics. And it occurred to me that there's actually like a deep, rich connection here, between um, what I take at least to be Marx's ethical intuitions. He does, I would argue, that these ideas do kind of infuse his writing, even though he always resists what he would call moralism. Though I don't think that's the same as moral philosophy or ethics, But he does reject moralism. But he's very clearly and consistently concerned with, the kind of life that we're subjected to living in a capitalist society, right? I think the chapter that really drew me on that the most was his long chapter on the working day, which is where you can see like a few arguably normative claims in there actually, um, particularly about like how we need to shorten the working day, you know, and his praise he calls like the modest Magna Carta, you know.
Yeah.
Um, so that
No,
really,
that's very true. It's the most in line with Engels's prior work on the condition of the working class in England, and of course, there's been a huge. I mean, when we get to our discussion, I really want to dig into this because that was the dialectic of the working day. I think is the title of that chapter that you have there in the book, and you really get into it in great depth. And there's a lot of things we want to talk about there. A lot of things because we've studied the 1844 philosophic and economic manuscripts as a collective, and we've studied the anti-humanist current of Althusser, as I've already mentioned, and many of us have studied Capital. I've done a close study of it as well in a group with fellow socialists. Really, that's the only way to read the book, I think. um, so there's a lot to discuss, and I don't want to get too deep into it because I know you have some remarks to sort of perhaps like lay out the core argument and the core themes of your book, because there's quite a lot going on in this work. So, but thank you for that opening context to what motivated it. How I guess my final little question is, how long has this project been in the making?
um, I mean, I didn't start writing my dissertation until 2020, I guess. I think it was like right around like the start of COVID, because I mean, it took me 6 years to finish, so not that unusual. But my chair was like, you got to get started eventually, and I'm kind of bouncing around. Like maybe I want to do something on Adorno, maybe I want to do something on Lukács, you know. But then I always had wanted to write this dissertation, or maybe not, as a dissertation, but I always wanted to do something on Marx and ethics. I'm like, why didn't I just do that? You know?
Perfect. Yeah,
Um,
I love it. Well, Sam, please, the floor is yours. I will hop off, and then when you're finished, I'll hop back on, and we'll immediately engage in a conversation.
awesome. So I think, my my dissertation really began with like a extended literature review of like the you know traditional views on what Marx said about ethics. And I dropped that for the book. Um, but I think one thing that's I had argued in that section is that there had been treatments of this question before, just not very thorough ones. So there's Kamenka had a book a long time ago about this. Analytic Marxists have had some stuff to say about it. Sean Sayers and a few other people, but it wasn't really a topic that I think is. Oh, and Eric Fromm as well kind of talks about it a little bit. You'll find some people. McIntyre, if you've read McIntyre, he's got some very similar ideas, and he was a Marxist before he became a Thomist. But the my book it kind of works through the Marx's bibliography, right? So I start with the 1844 manuscripts. I probably could have started with his dissertation, but I hadn't read that yet. But the 1844 manuscripts, I think, are a really informative place to start. Obviously, it's something that Marx himself never published. I don't think anyone knows for sure if he ever did mean to publish it at some point, but they're largely in the form of notes. And in that text, he actually lays out a bunch of interesting stuff that I managed to draw from, including he had some interesting reflections on Mill, not John Stuart Mill, but Daddy Mill. But I think the most famous passage, and the one argue most support for my project too, was the writing on alienation, right? And he has these four forms of alienation that he's taking this idea of alienation from Hegel, kind of mediated through Feuerbach, so it's heavily modified, right? For Hegel, you are alienated from the object. It's just kind of like an intrinsic part of being human. Whereas Marx, he sees alienation as a feature of economic systems, class systems, most specifically capitalism. I think there's some debate about whether or not there was alienation before capitalism, or at least something like it. Uh, but his focus obviously is alienation under capitalism. That's what we see, and he outlines four types. There's alienation from what you make. There's alienation from the process of labor. There's alienation from species being, and alienation from one another. And I think it's like the third form of alienation from species being that I take the most interest in, because one of the things that's really central, I guess, to my thesis and my reading of Marx is that he does have a really robust theory of human nature, and this is an important element of his work. And unlike say Althusser, I think that this idea does track through even in his later works. And even though he doesn't use the term species being, he drops that. But the way I read Marx's theory of human nature, and again, he actually has a passage in Capital that repeats this pretty much word for word. But he says that, like, well, beavers, they make dams, and bees, they make honeycombs. But what really distinguishes human beings is that we produce socially. So we create these objects together, for one another, and we have this expectation that other people are going to make the things that we need. And what's most interesting about this is that our production is rational and dynamic in a way that beavers and bees aren't. So a bee will never make a dam, right? And a beaver will never make a honeycomb. But we can, look at honeycombs, and we can, you know, make houses for the bees and take their honey, right? We can look at beaver dams. We're like, hey, we could dam rivers too and make electricity or store water, So we're able to kind of pick up uh, from nature in various ways and develop ourselves different things that we can make, different objects, right? That we can master the production of these different types of objects and share them with other people, learn from other people. And this is, I think, for Marx, really what characterizes human nature. And so I try to, this is basically our species being to a certain extent, or is related to the concept of species being, that, I see Marx as kind of interpreting this in quasi-Aristotelian terms. So for those of you who don't know, right, Aristotle's theory of a thing's nature is that every animal, every plant has an ergon or a function, right? And this function has a specific relationship to its form, that you need to have a form that is adequate for fulfilling a certain function, right? So bees have wings so that they can fly, for instance. And if you can figure out what a thing's function is, you can determine what's good for it. It's telos, it's end. And Darwin kind of does away with all that, but I think Marx very much retains this idea for human beings. But for Marx, this nature, it's not a static thing. It's not something that remains kind of constant throughout a thing's existence. So a bee will always have bee nature, right? For Aristotle, at least. And Aristotle also thinks that human beings always have human nature, which for Aristotle means reason, rationality, uh, which is one of the reasons why Aristotle ends up being such an elitist in many ways, because Aristotle, if reason is what characterizes human nature, and what's good for human nature is fulfilling this function, then that means that only those people who are most removed from physical labor are really able to live in accordance with their true nature as human beings. But what I understand from Marx is that actually our function is socially conditioned in very radically different ways, right? So we are a very different type of person than the, I would like to say, the Native Americans or the colonialists who were displacing them, right? Or the Europeans back in Europe. But they were all very different from each other too. Um, and so we kind of take on different natures depending on our class society. And so what I say in the book at one point is that our ergon, or our function, right, is to create functions for ourselves, right, and to share these functions with others. Okay, so what's good for a human being then is highly socially conditioned, right? And Marx, he has this line in the manuscripts at one point where he talks about how a human in, say, a caveman society, they're happy living in a cave. Like a caveman could flourish, Neolithic man could flourish living in a cave or a hut made of sticks, right? But the industrial proletariat of England in the 1840s, or in France, wherever else, right? Um, they're living in slums that are actually comparatively still better than what the Neolithic person lived in, but are much less happy, right? They're much further from flourishing. They're much further from living in accordance with their nature, because our nature's changed, not in any kind of like genetic sense, but in what Aristotle might call second nature. Um, which I think for Aristotle is so much more narrow. But Marx, I think, really expands this idea of second nature, such that you know the modern industrial proletariat has very different needs and capabilities. Right? Marx talks about this a lot in the manuscripts as well. Right? That human beings, we develop new needs as we develop new capabilities. Right? But I think he's thinking in these Aristotelian terms, but unlike Aristotle, he's not thinking of this nature as like a fixed essence, but as, again, something that's socially conditioned. And this ties to alienation because, right, this is a self-creative capacity, right? And what I take alienation to be in Marx is something that you have created being taken away from you, right? You're now deprived of this thing that is your own, is of your own nature, and this self-creative aspect is taken away from us, right? It's taken over by the logic of capital, such that now your nature is determined by the logic of capital. And if capital has no interest in you living a happy life in accordance with your ergon, or a telos, an end, a final end to your life that's actually achievable, then capital's fine with that, right? Um, in fact, it may help it, right? If you're more desperate, right? If you're more locked in need, right, and you're unable to escape, you may be easier to discipline as a worker, right? So, in a way, capital is this alien thing that we create, and then it comes to dominate and control our self-creative capacity, right? And this is something that I think is universal for Marx. So the bourgeoisie suffers it too. It's just they suffer it in a much less acute way, right? So members of the bourgeoisie might always be stressed out about their competitors beating out their business rivals, okay? But they get to enjoy a cigar and expensive whiskey while they're stressing about that, right? The working class is maybe more stressed out, but also doesn't have the benefit of at least the physical comforts and the luxuries. And so I think that that's a really important component for at least early Marx. Um, but what I think is really interesting is you actually see these ideas in Capital as well. So I think you know Althusser talks about this turn in Marx, like a change, kind of like Heideggerians also talk about like, oh, Heidegger has this turn, right, in like the late 30s or early 40s, or maybe whenever the Nazis lose power and he has to sort of pull a 180 for political reasons. But there's this argument that Althusser puts forward, um, that the early Marx is humanist, right? So it's something like what I laid out. But the late Marx, he's really committed to developing a scientific philosophy devoid of these kind of humanist interests. Um, and I think to some extent that's true, in the sense that Marx does become much more interested in rigorously figuring out the mechanics of the capitalist economy, right? But I don't think he loses that early sort of humanist interest, and therefore also an interest in ethics, right, and how we ought to live, and how in a way capitalism imposes a life on us that's really not adequate for who we are and who we ought to be. And so I think that this is something that you can see in Capital, but that example of the bees and the beavers I mentioned earlier, it's in the manuscripts and it's also in Capital, right? And he gives that chapter, he details his theory of human nature, and it's still remarkably similar, right, to his earlier theory. Now it's a small part of the work, but it's important to the work. It was important enough for him to put in there, and the ideas that he lays out there continue out throughout the later work. So I think one of the chapters that I devoted the most time to was the working day chapter, because I think this is kind of where you see these ideas playing out, right? That capitalism, one of its supposed benefits is incentivizing the creation of all this labor-saving technology, right? We invent the train, and the train makes it way more efficient to transport large amounts of goods, right? So you'd think, okay, logistic workers are now going to have a much shorter working day because they can use a train and move the same amount of goods or a much greater amount of goods in a much shorter period of time. But the reality, I don't know if it's quite a paradox per se, but at least the counterintuitive result is that workers end up working longer hours, right? And I won't get into the incentive structure that makes that possible. It's really interesting, it's really important. But what was more important for my work instead was the way this sort of sets up a weird sort of moral conflict, as it were, between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. And so, as I said earlier, like, we create our own nature. Okay. So the bourgeoisie, okay, they create a social system which has certain impacts on human nature and also human practices, and therefore the morality, the ethics that we have around those practices, which really focuses on free exchange, right, and individual rights. And so everyone has a right to sell what they have for the price that they can get. And the bourgeoisie, they look at the working class and they say, well, the working class works 14 hours a day because they want to, because they need the money to live. And that's true, right? They do need the money to live. And they do consent to work 14 hours a day. But the proletariat has a very different standpoint on this, right? Because the proletariat says, well, we're only working this many hours because we're all competing with each other for these jobs, and we need to give as much as we can and get as little back as possible because that's what the market mandates. So the workers, right, band together to shorten the working day. Uh, and they do this for a number of reasons. Not only does it make their own lives better, but as Marx argues later in the text, it also helps to solve the problem of unemployment, which, because one of the side effects of having workers work these long hours, you don't need as many workers. So there's more unemployment, which drives down wages because the job market is full of unemployed workers. So, Marx argues very strongly the working class ought to band together and impose on the state some kind of, you know, and on the capitalists, right, a legally limited working day. But the capitalists say, well, this is a violation of basic, you know, rights. This is immoral, right? The workers are banding together. It's a violation of, the principles of competition and entrepreneurship. And the lazier workers are just imposing their laziness on the workers that really just want to work 16-hour shifts, right? And so Marx kind of sets up this like a I go like the dialectical sort of struggle where the bourgeoisie and the proletariat are conflicting with one another over this particular issue, um, where both sides have a moral view and both sides have reasons for their moral view that they can argue from their own sort of standpoint, right? And Marx, like one of his arguments is that both of these standpoints are rational to a certain extent, right? He doesn't think that the bourgeoisie is all evil, right? I mean, his best friend is a member of the bourgeoisie. Uh, so he doesn't want to say, oh, the capitalists, they're just these bad, terrible, awful people. I mean, a lot of them are, and he does detail how a lot of them are these terrible, greedy people. But even if they were the best people in the world, right, they're still kind of constrained by the same incentive structure and end up, with just a more enlightened version of the same basic moral framework. And the proletariat, on the other hand, they're going to tend to see the competitive labor market as a hindrance to their flourishing, right? As something that harms all of them, right? And so what Marx really advocates for, at least among the workers, right, is they adopt this kind of ethos of solidarity where they recognize that, all the other workers are, ends like they are ends, and that only together, with this sense of like a moral bond between all the workers, can they actually impose, a better way of living, right? And I think for Marx, it's very much like prefigurative of socialism in various ways, right? Like he even says it in, I think, the Trinity formula in the third volume. I think that's a chapter. It might be a different chapter. But it's in the end, one of the last few chapters of the third volume. He says that the shortening of the working day is a prerequisite for, you know, uh, the true realm of freedom, as he calls it, by which I understand him as saying, like, this true realm of freedom is not necessarily unproductive time, right? We might be doing productive things, but we're also spending time with our family, we're reading books, we're working on ourselves and cultivating ourselves and becoming richer individuals. And we're helping other people to enrich their own lives, right? So the shorter the working day is, the and we do need a working day, right? We do need to make sure every house has electricity, that the water works, that people have clothes to wear and food to eat, right? But we need to minimize the time invested in that, which we can achieve with labor saving technology, but only under socialism, right? Because again, under capitalism, they will just use that technology to extend the working day. But you know, once we deal with that necessary labor, once we've managed it effectively, then the rest of our time is for this enrichment and for this diversification of capabilities and needs and personal development. And only then, do we have this you know realm of freedom that Marx emphasizes. Anyways, I think I've been going on for about, is it 20, 25 minutes? So I don't know if it's a good time for questions.
Wonderful, Sam. Thank you. I have so many questions and thoughts your book has provoked. So and we have some comrades with us that I'll bring onto the screen in a moment. But if I might, I was very interested in your section and your wider discussion on tragedy, because there seems to be like a few ways into understanding what is meant by tragedy and the tragic condition, because you do adopt or you do support the notion of class standpoint. And Leon Trotsky famously would write a polemical text like "Their morals and ours," right? Where clearly the invocation is that there is something like a class morality. But then you also introduce critics to that idea. And the problem, I think, of historicism becomes important here. And as I understand it, and I want to invite you to perhaps maybe articulate this a bit more, the idea would be that some Marxists believe that Marx's view on morality was that all versions of morality are kind of reflective of the dominant class morality. And therefore, to presume that we could ever have some kind of coherent proletarian standpoint of a morality is missing the mark, or missing the point. And you seem to be pushing against that claim, as I understand your argument. Can you put some meat on that bones there for us? I'm trying to sort of outline the wider stakes of this part of your book. It's frankly something that I've wondered about, especially in our day and age, in which the institutions of the working class that reflect working class interests are so absent. So then the problem, or the conundrum, of class standpoint morality becomes even more pronounced than certainly it was historically. So that's my first sort of area of concern and questioning. What do you think about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. That was actually one of my, the chapter on tragedy was one of my favorite ones to write. It actually was written after my dissertation. And I think, there were a few things going on. One was that I had been reading Don Quixote while I was studying for the dissertation, and I kind of saw in this, and then Marx has like a few little passages on Don Quixote. Oh, there's this interesting idea that Marx seems to have. Like he has a footnote, right, somewhere, that it seems like different classes have different moralities, right? Which I think butts up against the view that you mentioned. That there's like the dominant ideology and that has a morality, and that is the morality of a system. Um, and that's something that Alan Wood, the Kantian scholar, not there's a Trotskyist with the same name, but the Kant scholar, he has a book on Marx, it's quite good. And his whole argument is that Marx has no morality, right? Except for this like sociological theory that the ruling class sort of just imposes their morality on everyone. And so what we really need is sort of like anti-moralism. Um, and I can see like where you get that from Marx, but I do think that there is this idea running through that no, actually, like yeah, like the ruling class has their morality, but you the other classes are autonomous. They're going to develop their own norms, right, within their own setting. And those norms aren't going to be entirely separate from the ruling ideology. I actually see this in Engels a bit, where he talks about how, the proletariat criticizes capitalism. This is an anti-Düring. They criticize capitalism both using bourgeois morality and, he says, like a more universal kind of morality. Um, but what I take it to be is that, for Marx, uh, uh, the other classes, one thing they will do is appropriate ideas from the ruling morality and modify them or invert them or reinterpret them. And so, the working class, for instance, they might see the uh, wage relationship as an unfair exchange by bourgeois morality, right? Because with bourgeois morality, if I sell you a car, you know, you get a $10,000 car and I get $10,000, right? But I work, I get paid, $80 for the day, but I make $120 worth of commodities for the capitalists, right? So the proletariat does appropriate bourgeois morality, but they modify it, but they also develop their own moral standards within their own practices. And I think this is kind of where some of the standpoint stuff comes in, which I know is these days more associated with different forms of feminist critique. But you can trace that back genealogically through Lukács to Marx. And the way I understand it, at least, is that the morality comes out of your interests and practices, right? At least for Marx and Engels. But your practices and your interests are going to be very different depending on your class. So it's kind of inevitable that people will develop different moral views based on those factors. That doesn't mean that everyone is in that class is going to hold that morality. Engels, obviously endorses the proletarian morality, and among the working class, you're going to find many people who are like the billionaires who want to, or what was it? I can't remember. I'm blanking on the famous quote, but um, um, that you're going to find a lot of workers who really just think like the capitalists are the greatest thing, and that
Oh, you're
wealth
thinking
comes
about
from hard work.
the John Steinbeck quote,
Yeah, it was Steinbeck. Yeah,
the Steinbeck
yeah,
quote of every American thinks that they are not working class, but just a temporarily embarrassed millionaire.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah, that's the quote. So there are going to be workers who think like that, right?
Oh, yeah.
But I think for Marx, the general trend is that most capitalists are generally going to have a standpoint more informed by bourgeois morality, and workers are going to have a standpoint that's more informed by proletarian morality. And I think where this really clicked was that I read Hegel's essay on natural law, and you see this in Hegel's aesthetics as well. Hegel talks about conflicting moral standards, and he ties this to ancient Greek tragedy, right? So the famous example is Antigone and Creon that Hegel loves to talk about. The Oresteia is another good example, but Antigone's simpler. Right? Antigone wants to bury her brother, but her brother's a traitor, right? So Creon says he can't, or I'll, execute anyone who tries to bury him. But she has to because it's her brother, and that's like the obligation in Greek domestic morality. So there's a conflict between domestic morality and religious morality, which is you ought to bury your loved one, and civic morality, which is you ought to shun traitors, right? And I think, I read Sophocles at least as trying to present both of these as at least somewhat reasonable, right? And you end up with like a conflict between these moral views that ends tragically for everyone involved, because everyone's sort of bound by both moral systems. So there's no good way out, right? You To do good, you have to do a wrong, and to the other way as well, right? To not do the wrong, you have to not do a good, right? And I see for Marx, like this is what happens to morality under capitalism, right? You have a conflicting bourgeois morality and proletarian morality, and everyone in the system's kind of bound by both, though they may only recognize one or the other. They might recognize both, right? By the way, we're kind of like locked in this tragic struggle, and that's a part of the reason why Marx thinks that socialism is the way out. That
What would
resolves
you?
tragedy.
Yeah. So so let's probe this a little more. What would you say to the question of class morality as um, something requiring an education or an ideological um, thrust so that workers are shown because there seems to be like a kind of question about rationality at play and ideology at play with the problem of morality, insofar as the claim seems to be, on the one hand, that capitalist society, through the impersonal forces of domination, of exploitation, and of commodification over um, the species being of the human, is affecting proletariat and bourgeois in distinct ways. But it's also true that that may not be immediately apparent, or that subjective difference may not be internalized or registered as a true difference that elevates. So one would then say, yes, well, class consciousness is an essential component to. So you see the outcome there is interesting, because if we go back to the New Left, to the 60s, to Althusserian anti-humanism, I understand their practice to be against a goal of proletarian education that would be around an affirmation of something like, yes, indeed, we have something that is like a distinctive morality. They would cringe at some proposal like that.
Yeah.
Right? This is a question that I think your work leads me to wonder how to navigate, because I do think that Marx's claim in the German ideology that any given epoch is dominated by the ideological interests of the ruling class, the same goes with morality, at least at the level of how we conceive of morality. So what I'm wondering is, could you talk about education and consciousness in relationship to morality and class morality? And do you understand these? Do you understand my finer questions here? And but please push back if any of that doesn't make any sense.
No, I think it does. And you can like probe me further if I miss something. But I I think for Marx, I mean, I think it is very much a question of education. I mean, it's you know, and this also goes back to the issue of standpoint. Like the first real effective and robust advocate for proletarian morality, I think, isn't even maybe Marx himself, but Engels and his, you know, conditions of the working class, who again is not only highly educated but also not even a worker, right? And he's able to like recognize the sort of objective conditions that the workers are in, right? Which is, again, I think at some point I argue that like today we talk about standpoint in like these strictly subjective terms, but I think for Marx and Engels, like the issue of standpoint is maybe much more objective. Um, that the worker might have certain moral intuitions. They might have certain ideas that are kind of at odds with everyday morality of the existing system, but they don't necessarily have the intellectual background to like systematize that or articulate it well. Sometimes they do. Like there's this one worker, I think in the 1800s, who's like German worker, and Marx and Engels kind of praise him as this, brilliant autodidact who like sort of like reinvented the wheel on dialectics. I'm blacking on his name. Um,
Yeah, Dietskin. Yeah, Dietskin.
exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
Um,
Dietskin is an incredible figure, especially in the United States, because he retired to Chicago and became really, I think, the main philosopher of the proletarian movement, especially in the wake of the Haymarket Massacre. So Dietskin was, yeah, they credit Dietskin as the philosopher of the working class movement of his time. They had, I think, profound admiration for him. Sorry, but yeah, please continue.
yeah. Yeah. Actually, I didn't know that. That's interesting. I didn't know that he moved to the U.S. I've started reading some of his stuff. It's kind of very preliminary. Um, but there are definitely going to be workers like that, but they're going to be in the minority. And I think, but they do still seem to have this in this kind of like inchoate form. Like there's this great part in the 1844 manuscripts where Marx talks about how, you can see this is like a story that came out of him like visiting some, I don't say pub or like drinking hall or something in Paris, but he talks about how all the workers are there, drinking and smoking and playing cards and like, you know, they're sort of embodying elements of proletarian morality, but they haven't necessarily systematized it, right? And I do think for Marx, they they do sort of need the science, right, to really be able to figure out well, what is the truth of their moral complaints and their indignation. And they may not even have any confidence in it, right? Like something doesn't feel right about the system, but my priest tells me this, and the school teacher tells me that, and maybe I shouldn't really overthrow the system. Um, but I think one of the things that Marx is trying to do in Capital is he's trying to lay out the mechanics of capitalism in non-moral terms. Of course, I mean, as I say, like the morality is in there, but I don't think Althusser is wrong when he says like, well, this is primarily work of science, right, in economics. Um, but by understanding the economics and by seeing the connections between that and your indignation, then I think for Marx you're able to systematize these ideas, right? And you're going to have your community of solidarity, or labor unions, or syndicates, or the international, the parties. But within that context, once you start introducing the more kind of rigorous and scientific ideas, you're actually able to reflect on your moral commitments and your indignation at the system, not in the way that like I'm going to go explain to the capitalist why he's wrong and he's going to give me the means of production, but instead it's like we're going to have confidence among ourselves that we're on the right side here, and that we can institute norms amongst ourselves that are going to help govern our collective labor movement such that we can have a better life in the future.
I wanted to ask you to address the concept of immiseration, which you wrote a nice Substack recently on this idea, and it was really interesting to read your Substack because we had debated. I think one of the rationales for discarding the 1844 manuscripts as relevant is that Marx relies on a kind of primitive idea of the immiseration thesis in it, meaning that for Marx at that time, there's a sort of, maybe you could say, a naive causal claim going on that revolution will be sparked, almost like predictive history, like Professor Jiang, like, it will happen this way. But I think that he abandons this as the class struggle goes in different directions. And the 1848 revolution, in fact, faces certain deadlocks, the rise of Bonapartism, and other dynamics. So the immiseration thesis is seen, and putting aside its validity from the standpoint of political economy, the rise of welfarism within Bismarck's Germany, for example, challenges the immiseration thesis. At the same time, you offer, I think, a different way to conceive of it that helped me see a sort of red thread of its relevance. Could you? I know it's not something that you plan to talk about, but it is something you've recently written about. Would you mind sharing your kind of your view on the immiseration thesis?
Yeah, uh, it's a great topic, and you're right. It is something that, yeah, Marx in the manuscripts, he's like, yeah, all the workers are getting poorer and poorer, and eventually they're just going to have to overthrow the system. Um, but I do think he's come upon like a more mature version of that in his later work, where immiseration is something that happens, but it's not like this kind of like iron law of history. There are multiple different factors that are going to play a role, right? So, um, yeah, and I think you can explain that by saying, like, in the 1840s, workers had been getting poorer and poorer and poorer, right? Like that had been a process that had been occurring. But by the 1850s and the 1860s, you start to see like more complicated dynamics taking place. And I think for Marx, he does think that like there are general trends in capitalism that, if unchecked, will tend to produce immiseration over time. And so this would be, if you just like unleash, industrial machinery with no labor protections and no welfare systems and no political power at all for the workers, then yeah, you'll generally see like I don't say progressive, a regressive, I guess, move to more and more immiseration. But Marx does argue the um, in Capital, in the first volume, that the wage level is also normative, right? That there's an element of like workers expect a certain standard of living. But not only that, the capitalists also expect that the workers will have a standard of living. So these days, your boss expects that you'll have a phone, right? And that's just taken for granted. So he's going to pay you enough to at least be able to afford an iPhone as well as the rent and the food, right? And if he doesn't, he knows he can't call you, right, to get you to work. And there are many different factors that can change this normative dimension. Some of it will be new technology. Some of it will be shortening the working day. So if you shorten the working day, Marx thinks paradoxically actually increases wages because it reduces the competitiveness of the labor market. So, and that's another thing that Marx talks about, right? Wages go up, he argues, when capitalism is booming, right? When it's growing really quickly, wages are going to start rising because there's a lot of jobs and not a lot of workers, right? Um, and and so I think one of the things that we've seen actually is that Marx argued very forcefully that we ought to shorten the working day, and I think you can make a pretty good case that that was a major factor in counteracting the process of immiseration for these few generations, right? Didn't eliminate it, and you still maybe get relative immiseration. So, capitalists might be getting a bigger share of the pie as time goes on, but workers don't necessarily feel that because their wages are still going up in absolute terms. So they're still making a little bit more money in absolute terms than they were last year, even if the capitalist is making way more money, right? Um, but I think what eventually happened is that economic model sort of wore itself out. And actually, you do see rising immiseration, especially in America, since the neoliberal era. And oftentimes, it doesn't just occur through like lower wages. It might occur also through increased rents, right? So inflation will cause immiseration, even if you're making more money in, you know, numerical terms. You're effectively making less money, right? And also your labor can become more precarious, right? And there's a bunch of different factors behind that, right? You know, um, it might be migration, like people moving around, right? You maybe have a less competitive labor market here now because of migration, or in a more competitive labor market over there, which drives immiseration. Um, it might be new technology, right, that displaces workers. It might be gig work, right, the rise of gig work. People talk about the precariat. I don't know if there's a precariat necessarily, but I do know that the proletariat, at least, has seen a reduction of job security. Also, you can gut OSHA regulations, right? You could also immiserate everyone by gutting environmental regulations, right? Which doesn't look like immiseration. But if you think about it, it sort of is, right? If you've got environmental standards, that means less of the economy is going to make our collective lives better. And maybe, the rich people who live in the Palm Islands in Dubai, or in the Hamptons, or, in Marin, or somewhere like that, they don't see it, but the rest of us feel it, right? Um, so
No, that's really helpful. I guess there's relative versus absolute immiseration, and also there's nothing that necessarily follows from or is a causal, outcome of immiseration, politically speaking. I think that's the heart of the rejection of the thesis, that proletarianization, born from conditions of immiseration, can in fact produce a quite irrational and incoherent politics where the proletariat becomes captured by some personalist Bonapartist leader, a la Trump or something like this. I don't think we should
or
ever be,
Hitler.
or Hitler. Yeah, exactly. But there's limits to these arguments too, because some of the conclusions then, say, of like the Frankfurt School will be to kind of give up on proletarian politics, which I think is not something you're interested in doing. And that leads me to my final question before I bring on Eddie and Matilda to also ask you a couple of questions. Teleology is invoked in your framework in a very interesting way through this logic of like the theory of the species being, but also through the kind of ontology of labor. And therefore, there's a purposive ontology of labor that every worker is a part of. And therefore, the idea of a society beyond capitalism would be one that would recognize that labor becomes a source for what Lukács would call in the ontology of social being a kind of proper purposive grounding of human flourishing. That is a very different teleological picture than the one that I think Althusser was against in his critique of historicism. And I wonder where you land on historicism. I wanted to ask you, reading your text, do you think that perhaps there's a strength in Althusser's critique of historicism? Do you kind of find yourself wanting to maybe say, I'm not convinced of any of it? Because I would contend that there is a kind of bad teleology that some Marxist interpreters have extracted, especially I'm thinking from like the late Marx, where there's a kind of conception of the disillusion of capitalism in a teleological, like like bad utopia, where communism will come almost, and I think Gramsci points this out well, almost as like an effortless, desubjectivized process. So Could you speak about historicism, where you land on it, and the question of teleology and history? I was wanting to ask you that.
Yeah, it's a good question. Um, it's been a while since I read those uh, parts of Althusser, but um, I think what's maybe any kind of like I think overly mechanistic reading of like historical development um, is something that I think Marx himself is pretty critical of, right? And you see this like even in his like dissertation, right? Like his dissertation talking about like the swerve, right? That you know, because Democritus is talking about like oh everything's just like atoms bouncing around, and then Epicurus is like oh but sometimes the atoms want to swerve and like stick together. Uh, you know, I always thought it was like interesting. Like that's where Marx starts, right? And there's always kind of been this tendency, I think, to want to understand, like, yeah, history is a sort of linear process. Um, and I myself, I don't think Marx ever really actually came to like a definitive conclusion on this, because if you read his letters to Vera Zazulich, he has like four drafts. He's like he keeps rewriting this letter, and then he ends up like sending her this really short thing, right? So I feel like Marx himself was still working this out, right? How much is historical development just this purely mechanical process? Um, and he clearly doesn't think it's like this purely voluntaristic thing, right? But I don't think he's like this kind of strict sort of Hobbesian, we're all just sort of machines and history is just going to move in that direction,
Right.
right? Um, there's just
And
one,
nor do you and I appreciated your conversation on Kohei Saito, nor do you think that Marx in his late years kind of, you know, says we can abandon historical materialism completely.
yeah,
You're not in line with that vision. Even though I
yeah.
really also appreciated, by the way, your conversation on colonialism and tragedy. That's a very nice section of the book as well. But sorry
Oh
to
yeah,
interrupt.
no, that's actually a good. I mean, it was a good find because I was just like looking for where Marx talks about tragedy, and then he talks about the tragedy of the Opium Wars. So I'm like, oh, that's is a perfect example. Um, and then this sort of like just exploded, with all these like different things I was finding about like the Sepoy Mutiny and stuff like that. This journalism is actually a great place to look. People don't study his journalism enough. There's so much in there. Um, but I think where was I going with that? Um, yeah, well, the Saito point is actually really interesting too, because yeah, like reading Saito, it's like oh, I like some of these ideas, but I kind of feel like I end up kind of like a flip version of like uh, the Chinese Communist Party likes to talk about Mao as like 70% right, 30% wrong. I
Mm.
kind of feel like Sato was like, oh, 30% is really good, but 70%, I don't know about this. So obviously a brilliant scholar. No disrespect to Kohei Sato. I don't agree with him
No, for
that
sure.
Marx
And
became like a
I'm
degrowth.
sure if he reviewed your book, he probably would push back on some of these principles you're working with in terms of standpoint and morality and class, and he probably would push against the coherence of all of that, because I do think that your model, because it's so grounded in an Aristotelian foundation, it does allow for a certain ontology of morality to actually function. right?
Mm.
And again, a lot of Marxists can I think that Marx is subtle enough that a lot of Marxists can choose to not adopt that ontology of
Mm.
morality. And that's something that's very interesting about our tradition, that it's that open, you know, that
Yeah.
we, do you see what I mean? So, but I want to invite Eddie Eddie was reading your text and very interested and moved by it. If you'd like to ask or comment, Eddie, the floor is yours, comrade.
Hello. Hi. Yeah, I really liked your book, Sam. It's really interesting, and I think reading off the story right with the study group, like this kind of was refreshing because you kind of see the marks that I see, right, the humanist marks that a lot of authoritarians, I guess, kind of reject, but I don't, right? And my question goes more towards right, um, where we go from here, right? How do we keep that Marx morality in mind when it comes to another world is possible. So to me, like I really like the chapter where Marx use irony and the hypocrisy of bourgeois morality, right? Like that's what got me into Capital Volume One, right? All the little references and literary devices that he used. So my thing today is there's new contradictions that come up, right? In Capital. There's new
Mm-hmm.
things that come up, right? I feel like we need an updated version of Capital, right? To kind of highlight these contradictions, right? But to me, it's like we could go in the wrong direction, right? Like you said earlier, right? We could go into a direction where it's Hitler, right? It's Mussolini, it's all these people, right? So how do we avoid that, crash there, right? And move towards,
Yeah.
Marxism that's more updated and that, moves to the right direction, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. Because Engels and Rosa Luxemburg presented is right. This is with like some like the history stuff, right? Like it's a choice between socialism and barbarism, right? And no one individual, unfortunately, gets to make that choice. Sort of has to be many individuals figuring this out together. I do think there have been a lot of huge changes, and actually, this is like one of the things I really like about Engels is on the family is that at the end of one of the chapters he says, "Look, like I have my own thoughts on sexual morality. Obviously, I think like love marriage is best, but hey, we're all like live. I'm living in this bourgeois muck. I can't really tell you the morality of the future. Don't expect me to, right? Which is, um, there's this like criticism you might make of Marx and Engels were like, oh, well, they were kind of homophobic, which they were. But, Engels would say, well, we didn't know any better. That's why I said this in On the Family, right? That maybe your sexual morality is going to be very different in 140 years, right? Why are you asking me what we ought to think about gay people, right? That's, um, and so, you know, that there have been like these huge social changes, technological changes. At the same time, there have been like certain things that have stayed the same, right? Or maybe not the same, but more or less the same. We're still overworked, even if we have a shorter working week. And so one of my things is that we ought to resuscitate this concern from Marx of shortening the working day. Maybe we need a 30-hour work week, right? We obviously wouldn't be able to get there overnight, but that's the kind of thing within capitalism that Marx thought the socialists ought to fight for 140 years ago, 150 years ago. I don't see why that's not something we can't fight for today, and will give us a basis for a more human future, right? Um, at the same time, I think there's like a whole bunch of new concerns about that they kind of couldn't necessarily foreseen, like data, right? This data that is getting sucked up by capitalism. Yanis Varoufakis talks about is like techno-feudalism, which I disagree with that. But he is right. There's like at least a new pattern here that needs to be analyzed that is deeply troubling. I just don't think it's feudalism, right? So that's, I think, something new that we need to figure out, like who owns data, right? I think that's actually something even like Zizek was talking about like a decade ago. So maybe we need a communism about data, and ecology. And I think it was like a third thing, like genetics or something like that. But I think like that's something that we need to think about. We need to analyze. I have to say I haven't given it a whole lot of thought, but it's a problem that I am concerned about. Right? That basically all of the information about us is effectively capital now that other people can sell, commodify in various ways. Like Palantir, just like this is a really interesting and novel example of, I guess you might call it primitive accumulation of a type. The British NHS cut a deal with Palantir to basically sell them tons and tons of data for patients on the National Health Service, and that's this socialized system basically becoming the private capital of I would say one of the worst corporations in the world. I corporations kind of suck in various ways, but there are some that I like less than others or dislike more than others. And Palantir's up there. I think also people have been talking a lot about automation, but I think that's actually something that Marx talks about, right? Marx talks about, so we just have new forms of automation. What we're doing now is automating mental labor, right? The labor what some people might call the PMC or something, right? But that's now becoming automated in the form of AI, and that's also causing new ecological problems, right? Yeah, and the Grundrisse, he has that fragment on the machine where he seems to even speculate about, like at some point we're going to have like this machine where we need like one worker, right, who works a 20-hour shift, and everyone else is just in poverty. And it's like at that point, like why not just have communism, right? And yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think like those would be the.
I really like that. I just realized that we didn't talk about a topic that is dealt with a fair amount in your book, which is the question of ethics and morals in a communist society, in a society which has overcome capitalism. And one of the things I really loved in your text, which it was the first time I was aware of this, is that beautiful passage that Marx wrote, that communist society will be one in which there's a fluidity in the division of labor such that, anyone can freely alternate between fishing in the morning, hunting at day, being a critic at night, or maybe I got the order wrong, but the idea. And you said that this actually was an Engels edition that was reflective of a kind of romantic, utopian, bucolic vision. And then you showed that Marx only added maybe the critic to the list. And that this is a kind of left Hegelian vision. And it's kind of actually not in line with what Marx would theorize apropos the problem of the division of labor itself, which is a big, and thank you for focusing on that. I'm writing a book right now, in addition to the one I'm writing with Derek Varn, on class theory, and the division of labor is coming up a lot for me. So, because I do think that it's at the heart of a certain oppression of bourgeois society, namely the division between mental and manual labor, which we often neglect to focus on. Thinkers like Polancis, the Althusserian school did focus to some extent on the problem of the division of labor. But in envisioning a communist society, one has to reconceptualize how the division of labor will work. In that quote I just said, you kind of also get, and Jody Dean has commented on this too, you kind of get like a a neoliberal retort, which is like, well, yeah, neoliberal entrepreneurial society already offers that if you work hard enough. And in fact, if you don't work hard enough and you haven't been able to be this fluid entrepreneur, it's your own personal failing.
Yeah.
So can you talk about what Marx would critique in that phrase, which he's credited with, but which you say is really an Engels vision? Can you say more about that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think what was kind of interesting about that is that I do think that Marx is not unsympathetic to that vision, but that he also, thinks that there's this basic problem that we also have to make everything that we need, right? And that we sort of have to like balance these two concerns, right? So I think, you kind of gestures to this, I think, in the critique of the Gotha program, that we we will, like once we make labor efficient enough, then only then really can we return to this kind of earlier state that maybe we had under like agrarian primitive communism, where labor is really an expression of your own, and maybe like some people get this under capitalism, right? Like artists who are privileged enough to live off their art without having to, become, I guess, slaves of like a record company, but that once labor becomes efficient enough, right? Once, hey, like everyone has to work 3-4 hours a day at some job maintaining the system that we all depend on, then we are free to use the rest of that time for fishing and for reading philosophy, being the critic, right? Without, he says, ever becoming a critic. So I think he's thinking like Bruno Bauer. Like you don't want to be a critic like Bruno Bauer. He sucks, right? Well, suck, yeah. But we did disagree with him, So you don't want to be a critic, but you want to do criticism. That's what Marx is, right? He's not a critic, but he does critique. And so we should all have that opportunity to philosophize, kind of like Aristotle says, right? We should have that opportunity. At the same time, I think Marx also doesn't want to impose that on everyone, right? There will be some people who gain, I think, more meaning from just devoting their whole life to a single task, right? So there are some people who are just obsessed with violin, right? And they make beautiful violin music. And if they want to play violin music 14 hours a day, knock yourself out, right? You don't have to fish and herd cattle and do critique, right? Because that's not what really moves you. But that's going to be like the point is like that should be that individual's free choice, the expression of what they really want in life. It shouldn't be something imposed on them by, say, the symphony director who's a capitalist who says, "No, I need you to play this violin for 14 hours a day because that's what I'm paying you to do. I don't care if you want to go fishing or read philosophy, you know." Um, and so I think like in that case, it's like an expression of freedom. It's like a free expression of the needs and capabilities that you as an individual have developed. I think this is kind of where you see some of the individualism come in, right? That Marx does recognize that we're all individuals. And I think what's interesting is that's only made possible through the division of labor within the factory that you can achieve those levels of efficiency. The problem is that under capitalism, it's most efficient to reduce you to one of those tasks. And that would be incredibly repetitive. It's a very simple task. You could easily switch to a different task if you got bored of it. but that would make the system less efficient, so it's not going to happen, right?
Yeah.
And so it's sort of like a conflict between the division of labor and freedom, and once we reach a level of social development and also a level of technological development, those two things can be reconciled, and you can have both freedom and division of labor, and human flourishing at the same time.
Yeah, that's very interesting. I was thinking also in reading your text that perhaps a practical outcome of a conception that indeed there's a purposive and normative foundation to Marx's understanding of the worker in capitalism. Perhaps one outcome of that would be, and correct me if you maybe see it differently, would be to perhaps like encourage a new way of thinking about organizing working class demands and solidarity around things like dignity, and kind of thinking about even like the construction of slogans that might help address this undergirding ontology, which may not be consciously known to the worker as such. Would you agree with that? Like, in other words, why not, even though it's very difficult, why not make an argument that socialism will be about leading a life without having to be humiliated every day?
Mm.
These kinds of demands, I feel a little absent. And in a way, they're kind of ambitious demands because they do call upon an educational project that would inculcate that type of standpoint class vision that would be reaffirming such a moral vision from the get-go. Do you think that what do you think would be required to do that? I would assume what would be required would be something like the construction also of educational institutions that would be up to that task.
Mm-hmm.
Because I do think at the end of the day, bourgeois institutions will not be credible nor reliable, nor would they even have the interest or the wherewithal to propagate such a vision, right? I think only proletarian institutions, we'd have to find, okay, what the hell's a proletarian institution? We could maybe define that. Do you think that's maybe a task of an intellectual to help formulate? Because again, maybe many workers already know the day-to-day humiliations that they face and the fact that they're not permitted to lead a life of dignity, but they've never seen a political project that would concretely, or maybe a little, but nothing robust. Have you thought about it like kind of like that? Like maybe, yeah, like what's the praxis? Because you do talk a lot about Marx's praxis, but like what about our present could your book maybe inspire or encourage?
That's an interesting question. The topic of dignity, I mean, it's interesting. It's like I definitely think that's in Marx, and the dignity of the working class is very important to him. But I think is maybe that's a place where maybe Kant is more of an influence. I think Kant has some really good things to say about dignity, right, in his ethics. I think one of Kant's examples is that if you go to a bar and offer like pay me $20 and I'll let you punch me in the face, like that's not a dignified existence. That sort of is like the life of the working class, right? Like we're getting money to get punched in the face by someone with a lot more money than us, metaphorically speaking. Hopefully your boss doesn't actually punch you. But yeah, I think one of the outcomes of the kind of socialization I'm talking about, and you see this come up in Capital, is that the good chunks of the working class, they just take a totally undignified life for granted. It's sort of just like something that they come to expect. You know, like at one point Marx was talking about these like typesetters in these London factories, and they're kids, right? And they can't even read, so they're helping create books for other people to read. They can't read. They have no skills, and they their hands get too big by the time they're 18. So they leave the factory, and half of them become criminals, right? Because there's nothing else for them to do. And this is in his chapter on education. Well, yeah, like workers do. I think need to develop a sense that their life is worth something, and that they should have the kind of life that's worth living, and they should have some sense of what that is. I do think like that is a space for like working class institutions to inculcate, not only kind of in the sense of like I guess what Freire might call like the banking model of pedagogy, where you're just like, hey guys, this is what a dignified life is, you know. But it's kind of like a more conversational way for
Yeah.
workers to sort of like develop that division, kind of, I
Well,
guess, in a conversation with intellectuals,
well, but also I
right?
think social democrats, I suppose social democrats would say to this debate, I say they would probably say, well, workers will only trust the socialist movement, whoever that may be, on condition that they begin to materially have some success in the policy arena, which is sort of their, say, like Jacobin magazine, right? That's like generally their rationale for working with the Democratic Party. Right?
Yeah.
Like if we can convince the Democrats to, bring Medicare for all, or even something even more modest than that, then the working class will finally trust us. But they then furthermore say that, well, this kind of intellectual dialogue is insufficient. We need something materially to regain trust of the class. So there's that whole neo-Kautskyist sort of dimension there, which I think is interesting,
Yeah.
and there's some validity to what they say.
Yeah.
I think there's some validity to that. Although I cannot, personally speaking, tolerate the Democrat Popular Front. That's a whole other topic. I know Eddie has to bounce. Eddie, just peace out, comrade. Thank you for hopping on, and hope you have a wonderful night.
That's right, Eddie.
So yeah, well, I think we're maybe reaching a conclusion, but I just want to thank you. Did you have a thought on that final point, though? Sorry, I interrupted you.
No, I think I do. It's interesting you mentioned the Social Democrats. After talking about working class institutions, because the old school German Social Democrats did do a really good job building working class institutions. And like, if we're like, what does a working class institution look like? Let's just read, the history of the Kautskyists. They did a good job of that, at least if they had other errors.
Yeah.
Now, I think that the question of like to what extent ought we focus on achieving like immediate improvements, I think is a really good one, and it's one that actually Marx does address, I think, in this.
He addresses it a lot. Yeah.
The place I'm most familiar with is in Value, Price, Profit, I think. Is this dialogue he's having with a sort of like Ricardian socialist, who the Ricardian socialist is like, oh, we don't want to increase the wage because it'll make goods more expensive. And Marx has a whole argument against that, but he ends with this really interesting bit saying, look, we have to fight to increase wages, and we have to fight for socialism. And if we're just fighting to increase wages, then we're like just no better than the sort of standard, I guess, bleeding heart liberal, which I guess we're not that different back then as they are today, right? And if you're just fighting for socialism and not current improvements, then the workers are going to be really cynical. It's like, you just want us to be poor, So until the revolution, like that
Right.
sucks. And I guess my own sense, and I think this is like somewhat informed by Marx's own views, but I think he's probably right about this, is that we do have to fight for both those things. But in as much as we're fighting for improvements in the here and now, we do need to maintain at least some autonomy and distance, I think, from like the mainstream sort of liberal
Yes.
institutions.
Yes.
I don't think I have like a very robust theory yet for like how to maintain that distance. I definitely don't think it's going to come from liquidating ourselves as the Democrats. I also don't think it's going to come from like forming our own little sect of 6 people and we argue amongst ourselves and have a newspaper no one reads that is explaining why this other sect is stupid. So like, I think we can maintain that. Like that was like the International Workmen's Association did have that distance from the Liberal Party. So German SDP did at least try for much of its history to keep that sort of distance, while also supporting on specific causes. And I think that is something that you could work out like a political strategy around that.
Yeah. Wonderful. Well, our comrade Matilda is here. Slightly bad internet, but Matilda has a question for you, Sam.
Hey, thanks for your talk. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Okay, cool. Awesome. I was curious if you had any thoughts on, and I haven't had time to check out your book yet, but any thoughts on just the general idea of like history moving from freedom or from necessity to freedom as like the context for like freedom from nature. People sometimes criticize some of that aspect of Marx, but like also I find that that does seem to be one of the like framings for like normative values in Marxism. And I mean, I had a couple of thoughts, if you don't mind, if I just kind of lay them all out real quick. It seems like that's one component, maybe like related to like freedom from the division of labor, freedom from the different forms of necessity. And I mean, I kind of characterize these as like related to like Schiller and like the bourgeois revolution, kind of these like really idealistic aspects of the division of labor as having a degrading character on the personality. And like at the same time, the division of labor like allowed for technological advancement so that it could be like returned back into humanity at the end of the story with like a kind of a total freedom. And then that at the same time, like I wonder about in Capital, like if it's a science, if it's like, you know, a science of economy, Engels has comments like Marx has made, you know, economic scientific like alchemy became chemistry. And it's like, where does a normative dimension in the project of capital lie? Like, is the science like a one that has like values in tandem with it as it develops? Like, or is it just like purely kind of this like exercise of like understanding societies at like an elemental level and how like different combinations of like the elements and positions result in different like forms of society with different forms of subjugation? Kind of like more of a focus on just like what results, like how does a class society and its different varieties result? And like, I suppose what seems evident in Capital is that transparency of social relations is like a goal, and that could be kind of like a normative dimension of like striving towards a transparent society, where there's no class relations, and like class being something that like kind of generates opacity in social relations. And then another aspect is like Engels is like there's no such thing as justice. It's really just like things are kind of out of whack between like the mode of production, the mode of exchange, and that like if we alter private property relations, like that sense of injustice will go away. And so there's kind of this idea about despotism as like a normative dimension, that like humans have like a sense of like being dominated and that they'll strive to free themselves from domination. Anyway, I'll stop there. But if you had any ideas on those questions, I'd be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, those are good questions. I mean, I do think one of the things that's important, and this is something I mentioned in my book. I would have liked to have gone into more detail about it, but like Hegel has this idea that freedom is a recognition of necessity. And so what does Hegel mean by that? It's like a whole complicated question. But I think what like Engels and Marx take that idea and kind of interpret it sort of their own way, right? And kind of go different directions with it. One direction is that or by recognizing the necessity in external nature, you are free from the costs imposed on that, right? So if I don't understand the way, my water supply has arsenic in it because it's getting pumped out of the ground or something, and then I get sick and I don't know why, I lack freedom, right? But if I understand the mechanics, if I understand chemical science and geology and germ theory and these other things, I can free myself from those problems, right? And I can still drink the dirty water if I wanted to. Maybe if I want to get arsenic poisoning, I probably won't. But now I have a freedom that I didn't have before, right? Not kind of freedom in maybe the kind of sense we talk about in the intro to philosophy, like determinism versus free will. I don't think Marx and Engels are interested in that question so much, but freedom in the sense that we're no longer constrained by things we don't understand. But I also think that means developing, freedom from the world that we create, right? That we create a world that imposes necessity on us in various ways, right? And a part of that is this capitalist system that we've created that has its own sort of mechanics and structure that, people didn't understand fully, I guess, if you're a Marxist until Marx wrote Capital, right? They did have Smith and Ricardo, who Marx generally writes quite positively of, although with Adam Smith, he does think you need to understand the esoteric Smith, which I thought was like this really interesting way that Marx puts it, right? But there is this economic necessity, but we have created it, and only once we understand it, can we really free ourselves from that, right? And the part of that is understanding the mechanics of capitalism, and that may mean understanding it in an impartial way, right? That doesn't mean we are impartial. Marx and Engels are obviously partial to the working class, but maybe what will best aid the working class in their struggle for liberation, which is something that they're partially committed to, is an impartial understanding of capital, right? And that just means this rigorous look at the mechanistics of the way capitalism works. It doesn't mean you're not interested, right? In the sense of like being partial, right? So you might be partial towards your class interests, but you're impartial in trying to understand the system that will allow you to pursue your class interests, right? And I think this is kind of where the scientificity comes in, right? And I think that's kind of where I'm maybe sympathetic to Althusser to a point, that like there is a point that Marx and Engels are very interested in an impartial understanding of the economy, but only really so that they can advance their partial interests in the proletariat, right? And it doesn't mean capital as a document doesn't contain, again, some like moralistic claims and kind of in favor of the working class, but it does mean the vast bulk of the book is just a rigorous and impartial economic analysis, because from Marx and Engels' point of view, I think that is what would most advance the interests of the working class. And then I think there is the technical level, which I think also relates to everything I've talked about, which is that a part of necessity is this machine of production that we've created, all the different factories, logistics systems, and most of us take for granted, don't really understand how it works. And only by knowing and mastering that can we really gain any sense of collective freedom, on a class basis or on an individual basis. I think I kind of at least gestured to most, if not all, of your points.
Yeah, I
There may be
appreciate it.
something I missed.
I liked your point about like capital as a economic work as a tool for freedom, I suppose, and so regardless of how impartial it is, it's serving a partial end in some way.
He's not writing it for the capitalists.
Yeah.
Although I do think if you're a really smart capitalist, you would read Capital and you'd be able to run a very profitable business off of what it teaches you. But that's definitely not what the book is for, right?
Mm-hmm.
Wow, great. Thank you, Matilda, for those reflections. And everyone, just want to encourage everybody to read Sam's book. As this conversation has indicated, there's a lot of really rich material here. And frankly, I think it's maybe fair to say I want to write a review about your book and Vanessa's book as something like a new paradigm mutation in contemporary Marxist philosophy, moving to a more humanist. That might be a final question for you, is where do you fall on this question of Marxist humanism as a label? Do you see merit in retaining it? Would you add a kind of hyphen or caveat or sort of, or would you say, well, we don't need to be calling ourselves humanists because ultimately humanism is a sort of species of the bourgeoisie and forget that. So I did want to ask you about that definitional question, which I know it's sort of somewhat superficial, but I think actually does matter. I think the world of how we intellectually position ourselves, because I do think that it's like a label, but it's also more than that, in the sense that actually there are consequences that come with these commitments. Like they actually do. That's what I think these practical things we've talked about tonight, kind of indicate that a bit. So are you a Marxist humanist? Is this something that, even though it feels, there is obviously a school of Marxist humanism, coming out of like movements like the Johnson Forest tendency, which are very interesting. Do you align with that? How do you situate yourself there?
I'm. It's a really interesting question. I do like a lot of the Marxist humanists, right? And I included them in some of my research. Like I like, like Fromm is a Marxist humanist, and so the Polish guy, I think his name's Adam Schaff or Adam Schiff. It's a very un-Polish name. So you'd think it'd be like Shafinsky or something, but no, it's like Schiff. I liked his book too. I think that there's a lot to learn from the Marxist humanists. I am not unsympathetic to the term Marxist humanism, although I might be a little bit worried about some of the baggage that comes with it. I guess I would say, so I think I had a good term for this and I forgot what it was, but maybe like a dynamic humanism, or like a pluralistic humanism, because I think that's danger with humanism is you end up essentializing what it is to be human, and it's exactly kind of what I'm trying to say that Marx, like, if he has an essentialist view of humanity, it's a weird form of essentialism because it's like human nature can kind of flower into many different ways. Yeah, there are certain things that human nature won't be able to do. We won't be able to dive to the bottom of the ocean, right, 3,000 feet or something, and breathe underwater. But one of the the most interesting thing about human nature is the fact that it could take on different forms, and that no two human beings are fully alike, right? And like maybe it may be the case that like every single thing that is a part of what we call human nature, there's at least one human being that lacks that particular thing, right? And yet we're still all human because we're a part of this social unity. And so maybe like a Marxist pluralist humanism or something. That if I were to add a caveat, or dynamic, or historical.
That's helpful. Yeah, that's helpful. I suppose one would have to caveat or add a kind of point of relief to the label of materialism, I would contend, so that, because I think that there are ways to sort of ground, or one could ground your conception of humanity on a kind of ultra metaphysical foundation or even a spiritualist foundation, which of course humanism tends to be open to that. So I would want to insist on a materialist foundation to my humanist Marxism. I think Matilda raised such an interesting point about transparency and the division of labor, and it dawned on me. I don't know what you thought about that comment, but it dawned on me that, like, instead of the debates that we had at the turn of the century into the Soviet period after 1917 about central planning and the problem of bureaucracy and all of that, seems to me that this question about the deformative and degenerative outcomes of the capitalist division of labor, that a socialist society that would insist upon this kind of minimal model of transparency within the division of labor is so essential, is so important, insofar as what it would open is a strengthening of the willingness of the workers to yearn for a different type of freedom. Because I do think that capitalist society is like it's like its own enclosed ontology of freedom.
Yeah.
Which ideologically has fetishistic barriers that it imposes on us. So we don't see another model of freedom. However, then you would have to ask, well, then why? And part of it is the normalization and the routinization of the domination born from the division of labor of capitalist society, and the surplus logic involved with that and so on. But if socialist society could somehow disrupt that, do you see that as like an opening to freedom itself, like, or as a new way? And I think you were talking about the notion of necessity there, but I was wondering if you might elaborate on that. It seems to me like that's hitting on something very interesting.
Yeah. It's an interesting point, especially because I think one of the things for Marx is actually that like capitalism makes social relations maybe more transparent, right, than they were before. Which maybe was true in the 1800s, but is maybe not true anymore. Maybe that has to do with how we're socialized, right? That in Marx's time, people were socialized as in like this quasi-feudal life, and they're getting thrust into capitalism. And now we're like, 10 generations in, and it's just like the water we're swimming in, right? And so we don't even know that it's there. It's not something that's sort of made apparent to us anymore. And there's that Frederick Jameson quote that I think Mark Fisher liked, and like Zizek made famous about like it being harder to imagine the end of capitalism than the end of the world. Maybe become a bit cliche among socialists now, but I don't think it captures that idea that we can't really see an alternative version of freedom anymore, which is weird because when you're reading about these workers in the 1800s, they all did, right? And they were less educated than us, right? Like they didn't have, they didn't go to school, or they did go to school, but it was like for like 2, 3 years of their life, and then they're sent to the factory. And they maybe get an hour of schooling a day in the factory because the law says so. And so, why is it that things are like this? And I think to a large extent, it's because we've become socialized in a way that capitalism has, as I say, it's like modified our nature. And I think what we would need to do is to find some way to kind of show that fact, like show we've to reveal to ourselves we've been socialized to live under capitalism, and that this is something we have a power to change, and that we don't have to take it for granted anymore.
Yeah, it's like there's that meme of Marx never accounted for human nature, from the libertarian meme. You've probably seen that. I'm sure you must have seen the meme. But that's actually an interesting outcome of your book, which is that to fight for revolution is to fight for a new foothold or paradigm of nature, that nature is this like sort of materialist dynamic process that the social system transforms in a certain way. Human nature is not this metaphysically inborn spiritual principle that is static.
Yeah.
That yeah, so that's essential, but it also says that, like, in fact, as Marxists, we need to become comfortable to actually invoke the normative and the category of human nature. But like, because before there's so much knee-jerk just rejection of it. I think your book is helping us sort of cognize, or sort of at least recognize, that this is a part of our tradition.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, there's people saying different things in the chat I can mention very quickly. Pop quiz: what's the dialectical opposite of alienation?
That's a
That's a tough one.
it is. I mean, I think in my it might be disalienation, right? I think at one point in my book I talk about
Yeah.
disalienation, that um it's actually like a sublated alienation, which I don't know if anyone else says that, but it was kind of a weird thought that I had, that when you're alienated from something in the factory, but when you make something for your loved ones, it's alienated in the sense that you're making it for something other. It's becoming alien, but then it's disalienated from you because you're consciously making it for the other, and you want them to enjoy it, right? Although I don't think that's a particularly orthodox understanding, I have to say. I think that was kind of me kind of going off in my own direction. So
Yeah.
uh,
I do think this is interesting, with your support for the notion of class standpoint, with all of the caveats that you bring to that. You're not I don't think you're trying to sneak in a kind of identity politics, or nothing like that. But one of the things that's interesting about the alienation question that we didn't raise, and I know it's getting late, we're almost at 2 hours. I apologize for the time. Hopefully you are free to entertain our questions here, Sam. Is, like, alienation of bourgeoisie proletariat is like a qualitative difference between these two forms of alienation. And it seems to me that again, an educational project would be necessary to discover means and methods to make that distinction more evident, if that makes sense. I think there's a lot of ways that we can relativize that, which result in a kind of bad politics. I don't know if you've thought about that before, or if that makes sense. Like Marx says a lot in his early work about how bourgeoisie finds a certain negative freedom in their alienation.
Mm.
They can fetishize it. And in subsequent Marxist writing, this is a lot that's been written about petty bourgeois alienation as a kind of perverting tactic on the proletarian movement, for example. Have you thought about these questions much?
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, I think oddly I thought a bit more about bourgeois alienation when I was doing my master's project a long time ago.
Mm.
I think that's this kind of an interesting idea about the petit bourgeois alienation. So, I mean, I do think that the way you're alienated is like massively different from like depending on your class. Like, and I think that the best example of that is our alienation from each other. The way a member of the bourgeoisie is alienated from other people is very different from the way a worker is alienated from other people. There are those similar structural components. So, on a fundamental level, both the worker and the capitalist are alienated in as much as we're all competing on the market. And everyone's competing on the market, right? For Marx. I think that's one of the things, right? That is important. Like the capital, like Engels says this in this letter to Peter Lavrov. I love this letter to Peter Lavrov. There's so much going on. Talk about like Darwin, and, all these other things. And at one point, Marx or Engels, sorry, says that the main competition in capitalism was actually the competition between the classes, right? So on one level, this alienation from each other, there is a universal structure, at least under capitalism, where we are all alienated from each other in the same way. On the other hand, it's also true that this common structure is going to manifest itself in very different ways. And so the way two capitalists are competing on the market is very different from the way two workers are, where it's like a few years back, my friend, this was actually last year, me and two of my buddies were all hanging out together, finding out that we had applied to the exact same job in academia. Luckily, none of us got it, but it's like suddenly the conversation got kind of awkward. It's just like, wow, like I want you guys to get the job, but also like I want to get the job too. So,
right.
Whereas the capitalists, it's like they have that same sort of competition, but it doesn't have that existential sort of register for them. So GM's like, oh no, Ford sold those 50 SUVs that we could have sold. Oh, bummer. Well, I'm going to go golfing with them next week, and they'll make fun of me about that. Right? It's very different, but also kind of the same.
Yeah, for sure. And I think like there's the tendency of a lot of Marxists to abandon the revolutionary potential of the proletariat has come at the cost of a new conception of alienation, largely, I think, registered or sort of theorized within the mode of consumption, not so much the mode of production. And this introduces, and in Derek Varn and I's book, I elaborate on this problem, and this is where something like petty bourgeois alienation would reveal itself as like a kind of affective frustration with consumptive patterns and wants and needs. The problem being that does not recognize the qualitative difference of need and exploitation that may be facing the proletariat, which if that difference is registered, that could actually be like a strong political difference that could actually be efficacious for raising that as a question of class consciousness. So that's something that we talk about. Anyways, I feel bad for going so long. This is only a reflection of our profound interest in everything you had to say, Sam. So thank you for your patience and for your insights tonight. I think we'll draw to a close, comrades. Thanks for the chat and for Matilda's brilliant questions and for Eddie's excellent questions as well. Is there any thing final that you'd like to mention, Sam, before we go? And also, is this book available at a reasonable cost? I think, or is it?
Unfortunately, I think it's still only available in the hardback. I got
Okay.
a copy here. Yeah, it's Bloomsbury, and they've been great, but as far as I know, right? So I think Daniel, you're probably familiar with this, right? A lot of these academic publishers, their first prints are all being marketed to libraries, so they're printing out these very expensive hardcover copies that are sent out to libraries are supposed to last forever. And only if they sell enough of those hardbacks might they start printing out cheaper paperbacks. I don't know if there's a digital version. I'm sure there is.
So everybody's has to sort of, well, hopefully the libraries buy enough copies to justify the soft cover launch of the book.
Yeah.
That would be.
I don't know if it's on Anna's archive or anything like that, but I'm probably not supposed to say if it is. They'll send me an angry email saying like, "Oh, what are you doing?"
Right, of course. Well, hopefully this stream has convinced enough of you to get a hold of Sam's book, however you do so, and read it. And we'll hope to have you back on, Sam. This has been excellent.
Thank you. I had a great time. Thank you, Daniel.
All right. Hang tight on the back end and peace out for now, comrades.